Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our second lecture on the geography of folk and popular culture. If you recall from lecture one, we talked about the idea of folk and popular culture and their reproduction, cultural reproduction, the means by which they're reproduced, and the kinds of materials and places that they pay attention to or ignore when they are being reproduced. In that discussion, we actually started talking about a lot of characteristics of folk and popular culture as part of their reproduction. We're moving on with that idea now, as well as incorporating the idea of the cultural landscape that we reviewed as well. So let's get into the idea of folk culture and look at some cultural landscape examples of folk culture. I'm going to take you on a little trip to Ecuador, to the highlands of Ecuador in particular, where I have traveled many times. Some of these photos are a little on the old side. You'll see some graininess to the ones that are scanned, but you'll get the idea from the photos, hopefully still, even the ones that are not very high quality. So let's talk about the characteristics of folk culture. And so this overlaps a little bit with our discussion of how folk culture is reproduced, but these are also its characteristics. So folk culture is practiced by small groups, usually closely tied to a particular place. Folk culture changes slowly from time to time because it is passed on through generations. So you learn your folk culture usually from your parents or other elders in the community, and you pass that on to your children. And so the fact that it's I just said this, I'm repeating myself, but because it's, I guess I have these in the wrong order, because it's passed from person to person through generations, it therefore changes slowly over time. So we have that characteristic. Uh, and then folk culture can include a huge variety of material things and things that are maybe one step removed from a material thing. Like you can't put a musical form, you can record it, right? Or you could put it on sheet music, but the actual act of music or act of dance is something that would, be recordable, but isn't like you can't put it in a box and sell it, right? But that's still part of folk culture. Other things that are a little bit more concrete material culture, like the clothing that you wear or special clothing that you wear for specific events, is part of that as well. The houses that you live in, the food that you eat, not just the actual kind of food that you eat, but the way it's prepared is part of a folk cultural assemblage as well. So all these different things can be part of the folk culture. Not everything has to be part of the folk culture, but these are common examples of them. So to review as well, we talked about this previously too, but to review, when we talk about practice by small groups in closely tied to place, that means that when we move across the earth from place to place, we see different expressions of folk culture. We see different folk cultures in many different places. And then over time, it doesn't vary as much. So in one particular place, folk culture has been carried on by tradition for many generations in many cases. Let's take a look at some examples here. This is a public market in the town of Otavalo in sort of northern Ecuador. This is north of the town of Quito, which is the capital of Ecuador. It's in the Andes Mountains, so it's high elevation. And Otavalo is well known as a location that is a big market town. So the people from all around the villages outside of Otavalo, Otavalo is a medium-sized town. There's many, many small villages in the mountains around it. And people come into Otavalo to sell their goods, to trade, to go to the market, uh, to socialize. It's a really big deal. And the market was so large that it's actually drawn some tourists. And so I don't have any good photos of the market itself because cameras are not really well regarded there. Being a tourist and walking into that place and just snapping some photos might draw some unwelcome attention. And I always try and be respectful and ask people permission before I take a photo. But these people didn't mind posing for a photo. The story here, though, is that these people are selling kind of a mix of commercial wares and some more folk clothing kind of style of wear. So this guy's holding up one of their cardigans, and you can see here on the hanging, there's a lot of these hand woven alpaca wool sweaters and cardigans. So that's a really big folk cultural clothing that is worn by the people of the highlands of Ecuador. The indigenous group there that lives in the Andes in Ecuador is called the Quechua people, and they raise these animals and they harvest their wool and they make clothing out of them. I want to comment really quick about this because we've been talking about folk culture on one hand and popular culture on the other, and not a lot about some of the crossover that we actually observe in real life. But this is a really good example of that. So, for example, if you look at my mouse here, you see a pink sweater with Dalmatians embroidered on it, or not embroidered, but actually knit into it. And then these other sweaters have alpacas on them. So neither the alpaca nor the Dalmatian is a traditional Quechua weaving pattern. But because tourists will come and look for these sweaters, and because tourists have different tastes than the traditional folk culture taste of that particular region, these patterns will sell, and so those patterns are what are woven. So right away, we're seeing this interface of a folk cultural tradition of small craft weaving with the global pressure of tourists wanting to buy a particular commodity, right? And so that's interesting to note. Some people think that's great. Other people think it's not great because it's changing the culture. And I will leave you to decide, but we'll come back to that in a later slide. So we'll come back to that theme in general. When we talk about folk housing, this is a little farmstead, a Quechua farmstead high in the Andes. This was on a hike I was doing to acclimatize for a climb, and it was well above 11,000 feet. The pass that I left to climb up here was 11,000 feet, and I think it might have been closer to like 12 or 13,000 feet. So not a lot grows up here. You can see it's well above the tree line, so there's no trees. That tells us that these sticks that are being used here to frame in these huts are relatively rare. They had to be brought up from the valley where there were some little trees growing, so they're valuable as a resource. And you can see very few actually sawn boards being used here. There's a little animal pen of some kind right here, another one over here. This itself is a little hut that someone would sleep in. And so you can see there's sort of these pens for animals, a hut, and then not much else going on here. But I want to draw your attention to the roofs as well. And this underlines the point that folk cultures tend to use local materials when they're available. And in this case, using grass as a thatch to thatch your roof is a great use of a local material. It's much cheaper to gather the grass and pile it on your roof gently, sort of carefully organize it on your roof in a way that's going to keep the weather out, provide some insulation, compared to having to go to the store and buying the materials at the store. That cost cash instead of just cost labor, and wouldn't be locally available. It would take a trip way down the valley to a town that had a hardware store that would even sell you the materials. So great example here of local materials being used in a local building style and to create part of the folk culture assemblage here. This is a family that was near this that little farmstead that I showed you. This family was up gathering potatoes, and so I actually got a ride down from them. I had hiked way up the mountain, and I was coming back down. I chatted with them a little bit. Their first language was Quechua. Their second language was Spanish. My very bad second language was Spanish, and so we communicated in Spanish, but not very well. But I did have a nice chat with them, and they gave me a ride down in the back of the truck full of potatoes. A couple things about the folk culture that we can observe here is the style of dress. So this is very common for Quechua women to wear long skirts and then some kind of a blouse top, but not a very practical kind of blouse top. You can see both the little girl here and the mother are wearing these sort of the ornate collar, but still a full sort of like covering kind of cloth. And then cardigans quite popular. So you notice that the man here is wearing a cardigan. The woman is wearing a cardigan. The little girl is wearing a cardigan. We can't really see the boy in the back. He was being shy and hiding behind his mom. The adults here, and this is an adult. She's just extremely short. But the adults here are wearing these hats, and that's one of the signifiers of adulthood. And this is a folk cultural custom among the The Quechua in Ecuador is to wear these sort of old style bowler hats. And so this is something that came around 100 years or more ago, where the hats were coming into the country as part of a popular culture. And then the folk culture actually took it over as part of their own. And now it persists because it passes on from generation to generation that these are the styles of hat that you wear. So I think it would be hard to find these hats somewhere else, but it's quite easy to find them and you can buy them, and people are making them still for sale in Quechua communities. An interesting fact about these hats, and I don't have a careful enough eye for fashion, but I have been told that someone who is a careful observer of the individual Quechua villages can tell you with a reasonable degree of accuracy where someone is from based on the exact style of their hat, because different villages have different styles of these small hats that they wear. So some have wider brims, some have taller peaks. I don't know all the differences, but that's what I've heard, which is an interesting if true fact, and would be consistent with what we observe about folk culture, which is that as we move from place to place, we see variations, but as we go through time in one place, we see consistency. This is a different group of people. These are the village elders of a small community in the jungle side of Ecuador. Ecuador is split by the Andes Mountains. The eastern side has a lot of coastal plains that feature banana plantations and the like, and some other agricultural activities, but I've seen a ton of bananas there, let me tell you. Rice is cultivated there as well. I'm sure some other things are grown. The mountains themselves are highlands, and so not perfect for agriculture, but potatoes are popular, and then some livestock is raised in the mountains. On the eastern side of the Andes that run through the middle of Ecuador is the Amazon rainforest. And so a very different environment. And I was traveling through this region as well, and I actually stopped by this local village, and I asked these folks if they would like a photo, and I actually had a little tiny compact photo printer, kind of like a Polaroid, but one step fancier than that. And so the fun story about this particular village when I stopped by was I asked them if they wanted a photo, and I, like literally, do you want not me to take a photo of you, but would you like a photo printed out for you? And they're Quichua, not Quechua, but Quichua. So sounds similar, but a different group entirely. They were like, hold on, wait, just 1 minute. And then they ran away because they were wearing shirts and t-shirts and shorts. And they came back and they were quite done up like this. And so this is their traditional folk cultural fanciest dress, right? The fanciest clothing and costume that you put on. So the headpieces here, the fancy beadwork, the whole bit was, this is how you dress up for a really important ceremony. And they put it on because I was going to give them a photo, and they wanted to have the photo be of them wearing their finest clothes. So now, to somebody who hasn't traveled to a place like this, or to somebody who has been in, say, I don't know, Southern Europe, maybe, then this looks very unusual. But you can still see that it's quite fancy, right? It's quite elaborate and ornate in its own way. So there's a cultural universal here, which is that people dress up nice when they have a special event or some big ceremony, and the way we dress up nice varies from culture to culture. But this is a great example of a folk cultural costume in this case, right? Just like I would put on a tie if I were being even more formal than I am. So back to this example, these are the friends I was traveling with. This is Ñato, this is Rodrigo, and we're in a little sort of outdoor dining area. This is sort of a little bit touristy, but not really touristy, because these guys are Ecuadorian and they wouldn't go to the super touristy places, but they're dragging me along. And so we're stopping for a meal here, and the food is part of this cultural difference. So when you're in the highlands, you'll eat different food than when you're down in the Amazon, the upper Amazon basin. Here, the food is a lot of rice. There's some fish. There's a lot of fresh veg. And then there's this tuber here called yucca, which is sort of potato-like, but quite a bit different than potato too. It's a really kind of stringy, high fiber, and carbo-rich. I think it's a root, honestly. I don't know. Ask a botanist. I'm a simple geographer. But I thought it was delicious. And of course, here we have some of that popular culture where we got a 3-liter bottle of Coke on the table. So anyway, this assemblage of food then makes a particular folk culture, and the whole process of preparing the food, choosing which foods are grown, the choice of which foods go with which, the mix of those foods, the spices that you put on it, the way everything is prepared, all of that is part of this particular regional culture. Let's talk for a minute before we move into popular culture about the changing cultural landscape. What we've observed, and there's been a few clues about this already in the slides I just showed you, because not everything was purely a folk culture. We're seeing more and more that the combined forces of globalization, not just economic forces, but also globalization written more broadly, which is the increasing interconnectedness of places, has been leading to a decline of folk culture. And that is something that a lot of people are concerned about, because one of the things, not just because of the aesthetic reasons of we like to be able to see differences when we travel and we like to take pictures of that. That's a pretty self-centered reason for us geographers to care about it. But because people's identity is very often tied up in their folk culture, and diminishing folk cultures with a more uniform or homogenous popular culture feels like a loss to some people. And that brings us to the question then of, if it's something that is worried about in being lost, then why don't they just keep it? And that is a difficult question to countenance. That's a difficult question to consider, because it's not a simple matter of just resisting popular culture, although we can get to that in a minute, because popular culture comes in somewhat insidiously through these increasing connections, right? If you are in a small village at the top of the mountain that is 5 hours away by bus, and there's no communication in or out except for whenever somebody comes on a 5-hour bus ride, then you're automatically isolated. But the increasing connections that we see as part of globalization bring this popularization with them. The popular culture comes with as part of that connection. And so it's really hard to just say no to. So this is something that's worth watching, worth paying attention to, and keeping an eye on. And people are sort of worried about cultural landscapes changing in a way that doesn't preserve the authenticity of a folk cultural landscape. Let's move on to talk about popular culture's characteristics. Popular culture, in contrast to folk culture, is practiced by large groups of people and usually across large areas. So popular culture has an appeal to multiple different kinds of people instead of one group of people in one particular place. It can be something that's practiced by people of different ethnicities, people of different social backgrounds, people of different religions in different places around the world. So that's a general characteristic of popular culture. It doesn't have to be true of every single group of people, but widely practiced by a lot of different people. Because of its very nature, popular culture being popular means that it becomes unpopular and then something else becomes popular. This is partly driven by just its nature as ever changing, but also driven by the nature of commercial production. Because there are so many people that have a financial stake in producing new culture and selling new cultural elements, clothing, footwear, technology, new phones, for example, we see that commercial production tends to try and drive the change as well, right? So that, I think the iPhone is on version 14 now, right? Did we really need 14 versions? Well, the market says yes. So I guess there's your answer. Popular culture is transmitted through modern technology, and so we don't get pop culture just from word of mouth from generation to generation or from people in the village. We get it also broadcast to us through our television sets, through our telephones, over social media. We're inundated with messages about popular culture. We get it from billboards as we drive down the street, right? There's lots of different ways to transmit the idea of what's popular or what you should buy or what you should do. So that's a big difference. And then I've mentioned this already in passing, but let's talk about this big characteristic, which is that popular culture, and this is a critique of popular culture by a lot of people as well, popular culture really focuses on consumption and consumerism or commercialism, the idea that we are what we buy. And again, that's because there are lots of people who have an interest in seeing you buy more. So that's something that people who are worried about sustainability or worried about social issues will be quick to criticize because it comes at a cost, right? The idea that you're not cool unless you have the latest iPhone, first of all, seems a little weird. And I don't mean to criticize Apple, by the way. I'm just giving that as a handy example. But if you don't have the latest phone from whatever brand, right? Samsung or Apple or whoever else, or if you don't have a bigger TV than your neighbor, then you're not cool, right? Or if your TV doesn't have the highest resolution, or whatever kind of competitive consumer arms race that companies are trying to get us into, a lot of people are critical of that because it doesn't help the environment. It doesn't help us live necessarily longer, healthier lives. And so people question sometimes if it's a good thing that we're so focused on this kind of problem. Right. Not this kind of problem, but this kind of culture, I should say. Popular culture can diffuse contagiously or hierarchically. If you recall in chapter 1, I introduced hierarchical diffusion as a third kind of diffusion that wasn't covered in the textbook. And I'm glad I did because it came up in the textbook here and I said, wait, it wasn't covered in chapter 1 and now they're just introducing it without talking about it. So if you recall, contagious diffusion is spreading like a disease. So one person has it, then the next person, then the next person, then the next person. And so that doesn't have a power structure or an organizational structure, but it spreads. And so that's in popular culture, we would call that a fad, for example, right? You just learn about something, maybe it gets shared on social media and just catches off, goes viral, and becomes popular. Hierarchical diffusion happens with popular culture when influencers, whether they are fashion brands or real Instagram influencers, which are usually paid for by fashion brands, or celebrities, somebody in a higher social hierarchy starts trying to influence the popular culture and very often succeeds. So when a new shoe is introduced by a basketball star, that is hierarchical diffusion because the basketball star is telling everyone, this is my shoe, you should all buy it. It doesn't always work, but that's the goal, to have a when the shoe company does the business of designing the shoe with the big name player, they are planning to do hierarchical diffusion as part of that. They're getting someone in power, somebody high in the hierarchy, to influence people who look up to that individual. So let's take a look at some examples of popular culture, and this is about that commercialism and consumption right away. You should be able to recognize this place right away. Not necessarily exactly what it is, but you should look at this and say they are selling things. And if you look a little closely, you probably get a sense that it is something pretty nice. Something about the cases tell you that it's nice, and you can get an idea. There's a few logos you might be able to pick out here if you've got good eyes. But the photo is pretty culturally universal, and this is a characteristic of pop culture as well, which is that those of you who have traveled a fair bit will recognize this as having the somewhat generic layout of a airport duty-free zone. And that's where I have a quick comment to make about popular culture. Our book brings this up as well. One of the criticisms that people make about popular culture, it's definitely a characteristic of popular culture. The characteristic is that popular culture, because it's widespread and practiced by so many people, popular culture tends to create homogeneous cultural landscapes. That is, cultural landscapes that all resemble one another. And that homogenization of the cultural landscape is sometimes a cause for concern. Some people don't like that. And the thing that they don't like about it is that it's taking away the uniqueness of places, and the critique of it, the critics of the homogenization of the cultural landscape call it placelessness. And so here you are in a duty-free store in an airport somewhere, but do you know where? It might be hard to tell, right? All the same brands, very similar. You might be able to tell from the price tag what country you were in, but it might be in American dollars, even if it was in the United States. So this is kind of a tough call to think about what we're looking at when we look at this kind of thing. So now let's talk more about this as we go on here. You can tell this is in some place that has Spanish language because it says pronto aquí, which means coming soon. But notice the logo isn't in Spanish, right? That's the corporate logo of Starbucks. So they preserved the English. That's another homogenizing force. The globalization of English is a major factor in the spread of popular culture. And you can pretty much know what's going to be in this Starbucks, even though you don't know what country it's in even, right? This happens to be from Santiago, Chile, but it could be anywhere where Spanish is dominant, right? Which is a huge swath of the country, of the world as well. So that's another example of popular culture globalizing. And then here's yet another example. And I know I have a lot of fast food examples in here. I could look at other things too, but the fast food examples are really good. In this case, we have a McDonald's. If you look carefully here, you can see the script is in Arabic. And then they have the English play place there, right? And then over here, we've got English drive-through. This happens to be a McDonald's in Doha, Qatar. And then if you look really far over there, if you see, there's a Burger King way down there, right? Now, this is one of the criticisms of popular culture, is that popular culture spreads to a place. That's McDonald's going someplace, or Starbucks going someplace, or Burger King going someplace, or any other major American or European corporation going someplace and opening a chain. The cost to the local culture is that it's one less shop in that place, and its people have a choice to go there versus someplace else, but it means that it can have a displacement effect, right? So the fact it's popular makes sense because that's what these things are. People go to them because they offer maybe not great food, but reasonably cheap food of a reasonable quality, which is why they're popular. And then that means that there's less of what was originally here, right? Now you can decide what you think about that, but I'm sort of framing this as a potential issue that some people are worrying about, and I'll let you make up your mind about how to feel about that, whether it's a good or a bad thing. So let's talk about this global to local interface. We've been nicking around the edges a little bit when we talk about the spread of popular culture into places where folk culture is practiced. This can have a couple interesting manifestations. One I wanted to mention is that we can see sometimes small folk cultural features or items or crafts commodified for mass consumption. This has been hugely problematic when, for example, some kinds of wildlife, including endangered wildlife, that were used traditionally become mass consumed. So, for example, rhino horns, which were traditionally the best thing to use for the handle of traditional daggers in some cultures. That commodification of the rhino horn ended up becoming, and the rhino horn, by the way, is also there's a folk remedy that's believed to be useful as a folk medicine. I won't get into details on that, but when we have a increasingly globalized world where it's possible for people halfway around the world to purchase a rhino horn and have it shipped, air freight or smuggled halfway around the world, uh, that's that's a big problem because suddenly the demand for rhinos is much larger than if it was just a few people with a ton of money and it took months to get there on a ship, and so that was super expensive to get it, and so that meant that rhino horn might have been used, but it was more sustainable, right? So we've seen a lot of species put in danger um, or really harmed by mass consumption when something that is small becomes popularized and consumption increases. So this is a problem with finite resources and the like. The other thing that can happen, I should say, is you can see this sometimes when we see a folk culture, even if it's not a wild animal we're talking about from a particular place. If we see sometimes there's a folk custom that becomes popularized, uh, that then can be seen as co-optation. So people are doing it in a way that doesn't respect the culture it came from, and that comes at a social cost to the people who have their culture being copied and reproduced without the sort of the right features all brought along with it. Another dimension of the global to local interface. So we talk about these global forces sort of overarching, and then we've got local forces sort of underneath, and we can have things coming from the top down, the global to the local, like we just talked about. But we can also have things from the local to the from the local to the global, like we just talked about, or we can also have global forces sort of coming to the local in a different way. And this really one of the best things about this idea that I like is the new word, the neologism here called globalization. So which is when you take a global cultural feature and you localize it. So globalization is a global brand that makes a localized version. Here's a great example of this. This is from the outside window of a McDonald's in Delhi, India. And what I just wanted to point out here is that McDonald's has a lot of the characteristics that you would associate with a McDonald's anywhere. So like the McDonald's logo, English is quite common here. We see a mix of it's what's called Hinglish, right? So some English and some local language, but a lot of English going on here as well. And we've got a price tag on there, a happy price menu, right? But what I want to point out here is that if you look at the menu items, there is no beef because this is India and beef on the menu is taboo. And so we've got chicken and then iced tea instead of Coke. And because that would be what would be featured in the United States, for example, right? More than just chicken and no beef, there's also vegetarian items. So the Makalu Tiki is a potato bun or a potato. What am I talking? A potato patty, a potato patty on a hamburger bun with some condiments as well, right? Soft serve ice cream, and then a vegetarian pizza McPuff. So the menu has been localized. It's a localized menu from a global brand. So that's an interesting facet of this globalization trend. We've observed now that with increasing globalization, so that is increasing connectedness of places, we've observed that culture regions with pop culture have gotten more and more global. So it used to be we'd have a culture region of, say, the Eastern US or Western US or maybe Canada or maybe Mexico. But even in Mexico, there's culture regions within Mexico. So we wouldn't talk about something like a North American culture region or a European culture region. We might talk about, say, English culture region or maybe Scandinavian culture, right? So several small countries or single large countries we talk about as a culture region. But what we've seen with increasing connections between places is that we're seeing more and more global culture where, for example, we might have there might be hit songs that are popular in the US, popular in Germany, popular in Japan, all at the same time. So same musical artist might go big and get on the charts in multiple countries all within a week or two of making it in the first country. So we can see this in as we travel in places. This is again a photo from Delhi. This is a little bit of an old photo. You can probably tell if you've been to India recently, but the message here is the same, which is what we see here is that the use of English is common. Of course, Delhi, India was a English colony, so English is fairly widely spoken by well-educated Indians. It's quite commonly taught in schools and learned, especially people who are going on to higher education. But the message I wanted to show you here is that there's these sort of brands going on that are fairly common seeming universal popular culture. So Gulf Links Integrated Township sounds a little different than what an American brand might sound like, but they're selling this is houses on a golf course, which is super American, right? Also increasingly common in European countries as well. Sometimes for resorts, but sometimes people just want to live there, right? Here's another one called Hampton Court, right? Which sounds pretty British. And then I can't read this other word here, but it's something Royal Plaza, right? So in every case here, these are housing developments that are being created and sold and marketed, and they probably have some Indian features to some of the buildings. They won't look quite like an American building, an American house or a British house, but you can also believe that there's probably some characteristics of it that look not that different than a suburban development in a lot of places around the world. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about when we talk about a increasingly global culture. On the other hand, and I've alluded to this already, so I'll keep this fairly short, what we see is that we see an incremental loss of local culture as we see more and more global culture, because we don't have the bandwidth to have it all. You can't have both global culture and local culture and not have one obscure the other when it comes to one cultural landscape, right? So what we see is a resistance to commercialism as part of a resistance to global culture, and I've mentioned that already. So people don't always like the idea that popular culture, global culture, seems to be always telling us to buy things, but that's what's driving it. So that's sort of built into its DNA, if you will. But not everyone likes that, and they'll look with nostalgia towards the folk culture as saying things were simpler with the folk culture because we weren't being told that our value was in how much we buy or how much we own all the time. So that's part of that resistance to it. And then there's also a resistance especially from folk cultures that have a strong feeling of religious conservatism. And that's because popular culture is very often wrapped up in modernity, which is very often not often outright atheistic, but certainly at least not very religious, because it's meant to be broadly appealing and have a safe message about just buy things. And so to some people's religious values, that's offensive in itself, because hyperconsumerism isn't necessarily in line with those ideas. But also some of the ideas that we see being spread by global culture. So, for example, popular culture quite commonly uses sex appeal to sell, might have different social mores coming forward as part of that. A lot of global culture now is much more accepting of some things that more conservative religious cultures consider taboo. And so there's a resistance to global culture in that form as well. The most extreme versions of that resistance we see in the form of actual extremist religious groups declaring war on globalization, so to speak. And so, for example, the Taliban in Afghanistan were well known for destroying anything that wasn't considered anything that was considered. They destroyed anything that was considered profane to their extremely conservative Islamic view of what kinds of buildings should exist, what kind of statues should exist, what kind of monuments should exist. And so they were One of the things they did that got a lot of attention was to destroy some statues of Buddha that had been carved into a cliff face for hundreds and hundreds of years before they came around. So that's one example of some of that resistance. I wanted to comment really quick on some of this juxtaposition with a few more of these images here. And it's interesting if we look at the oil wealthy states like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, I mentioned already. And in this case, this is Dubai, which is one of the Emirates. These oil wealthy petrostates, they're sometimes called, in Southwest Asia, on the Arabian Peninsula in this case, have an interesting juxtaposition of this hyper-commercial, hyper-popular global culture in the form of these towers of steel and glass, but then also very religious conservatism in the form of the overwhelming majority of the population is practices Islam, and Islam is a state religion in most of these places. So there's this sort of juxtaposition of the super conservative with the hyper commercial, and they manage it okay, but it's not without the occasional sort of conflict that occurs. And so this is in the mall. And so again, when we look at the mall, this looks like a mall pretty much anywhere. But there's this interesting blend of, and the Emiratis, you can tell because the Emiratis wear their traditional sandals and clothing. These women, I don't know if they're Emiratis or not, because there are tourists that visit from elsewhere, and the women all dress very conservatively. But you can see this woman in the foreground here is not, she's not covering her hair, and she's not covering her forearms or elbows, so that's a little bit less conservative. And so there's this interesting juxtaposition here of the commercial being embraced, but then there's elements of society that are quite conservative as well. So, and then again, look at this. There's a Texas barbecue here, right? So there's this sort of this interesting combination to look at when you see that kind of thing. So what do I have to say in conclusion? It's been a while here. I'm sorry. This went on a little longer than I wanted it to, but maybe I'm a little more tired than I thought. I didn't mean to ramble as much, but I hope it's been interesting. So what do we have to say about folk and popular culture? Well, first of all, we see globalization continuing uninterrupted. People who have tried to slow or stop globalization have largely failed. There has been some opposition to it or resistance to the idea of globalization, but it seems like it's a pretty inexorable force. It seems like there's very little that can be done to slow it or stop it. And so I'm not saying that it wouldn't be impossible. I just haven't seen much evidence that anyone's efforts to slow globalization have been successful. It's an important question to think about whether folk cultures then in an increasingly globalized, homogenized world might disappear. And I think there's a couple interesting ways to think about that. I'm not going to answer this question definitively, but I think I can give you some thoughts to maybe spin around in your head a little bit. So the first thing I wanted to say about this question of whether folk cultures will disappear is no, they won't, because people always have some kind of a tie to a place that is about being from there. And I don't think that we're going to homogenize things so much that people won't have some kind of a hometown pride. And you don't need to look very much farther than people's allegiance to their sports teams, right? So in the Puget Sound, there's a lot of people who are really diehard Mariners fans, and even more people who are diehard Seahawks fans. And I don't think that we can say that having your favorite NFL team is really a folk culture, but I don't see it as that different from being tied to a place, having an identity with that place, which is kind of what we're talking about with folk culture being a culture of a place. So I think that idea of being from somewhere and being of a particular place is not going to disappear completely. It might diminish. It might become less and less important in some places in the world in particular, sure. But I don't think it's going to disappear. The second point I had to make about that is I think that we're always going to have subcultures. That's a sociological concept, but it's true. So people are going to have identities that are not the major group's identities. And sometimes it's about how they identify as a person. So they find other people like them. Sometimes it's about finding a group of people that shares an interest, or sometimes it's about not wanting to be part of the mainstream, which is a common urge. People don't like being too generic sometimes. So I think we're going to see cultural variation and diversity continuing, even if we see increasing globalization and homogenization. And then the last point I had to make about the threats of globalization to folk culture is that this is an interesting sort of silver lining, a little unexpected twist to the fact that globalization has made us so connected, especially via the internet, is that globalization also makes it possible for folk cultures to connect. So if there's somebody practicing a folk culture at home and there's somebody who moved away, they can still connect. It used to be that when people would move out of a particular place, they'd take their culture away from that place and they wouldn't, it would be a loss to that place. But now there's more connection between places. And so that gives a possibility that some folk cultural traditions or customs might survive, right? And the other thing that the internet and media and everything else has allowed us to do is document folk cultures, which isn't quite the same thing as keeping them alive as a live culture, but at least allows us to have something by which we can record them, right? And so, for example, if one of the things that my father's parents did was discourage the use of the language that they came from Europe with. They were encouraged to speak English outside the home and not to speak Lithuanian. And part of that then meant that some of the cultural traditions from Lithuania were curtailed with that migrant experience. We're seeing today that migrants are maintaining their ties to the homeland much more often in terms of cultural ties. And so I think that the internet today and rapid communication is making that more and more possible. So you can tune into a newscast today on the internet from someplace far around the world, and you can email somebody or talk on the phone with somebody from far, far away. So I think that's going to allow for more preservation of folk culture than we would have seen 50 years or 100 years ago. That is all. I hope you stayed with me for the whole thing. I'm sorry it took longer than I thought. I was shooting for around half an hour and ended up being about 45 minutes. But that's the way it goes sometimes when you're having fun with geography. I look forward to talking to you again soon. Bye for now.